What if the most powerful shift in a relationship is not anger, but silence? Not revenge, but clarity so strong that manipulation stops working completely? Because the moment an empath stops reacting the way they used to, the entire emotional system that once controlled them begins to collapse. Think about this carefully. Have you ever seen someone who used to explain everything, tolerate everything, and absorb everything, suddenly become quiet, distant, and impossible to emotionally move? That change is not random. It is the result of something deep shifting in how the mind processes emotional patterns. There is a very specific moment in nature when the sky begins to shift into a strange green color. Not gray, not deep blue, but green. Meteorologists describe it as the calm before a supercell storm. Experienced storm chasers instantly recognize what it signals. It means the atmosphere has stored up so much energy that it is no longer stable, and it is preparing to release something powerful and destructive. In a very similar way, an empath who has finally reached their limit follows the same pattern. They take in years of manipulation, emotional abuse, gaslighting, and psychological exhaustion. Then one day, something inside them changes. And when that shift happens, they do not simply react emotionally. They respond with a controlled clarity that can completely dismantle the system built against them. Most people completely misunderstand what empaths actually are. Society often labels them as fragile, overly emotional individuals who constantly suffer in silence, absorbing the pain of others while breaking down privately. This image makes them seem weak, as if they are just emotional sponges with no protection. But this idea is not accurate. Empathy is not weakness at all. It is actually a highly advanced form of emotional intelligence. An empath is someone who processes emotional information at a deeper level than most people can even notice. They observe subtle changes in facial expressions, shifts in tone, and even the smallest pauses in speech. Before someone even completes a sentence, an empath can often sense the real intention behind it. They are not simply feeling everything blindly, they are decoding it. Because of this ability, empaths function almost like emotional analysts. They constantly interpret unspoken signals, hidden meanings, and unexpressed emotions in real time. It is like having a mental system that translates human behavior into clear emotional data. When you have that level of perception, you are not powerless. In fact, you are highly aware of everything happening around you, even things others completely miss. The only reason empaths often appear passive is because they choose restraint. They observe, they understand, and they process everything, but they usually do not act on that knowledge immediately. However, that restraint should never be mistaken for inability. It is controlled power, not lack of power. The mistake narcissistic personalities repeatedly make is assuming that this kindness and patience equals ignorance. They believe that because an empath does not immediately retaliate, they do not understand what is happening. They confuse forgiveness with forgetting, and they mistake emotional patience for emotional weakness. This misjudgment becomes the foundation of their behavior. They push limits, test boundaries, and continue their manipulation under the belief that there will be no consequences. But what they fail to realize is that the empath is not unaware. They are simply observing, recording, and understanding every detail. A narcissist often tests emotional boundaries in a very calculated way, almost like a hacker probing a system for weak points. They do not attack everything at once. Instead, they push slowly, step by step, watching reactions carefully. Each time they see a boundary not fully enforced, they push a little further. Their gaslighting becomes more confident, their lies more polished, and their manipulation more frequent. Over time, they begin to believe they are completely in control of the dynamic, as if they are the one who understands the rules of the game. But what they fail to realize is that the empath is not confused or blind. The empath is observing everything with quiet intensity, recording patterns, inconsistencies, and emotional shifts in a mental archive far more detailed than any external record. The empath is not simply reacting to events as they happen, they are studying them. Every contradiction in the narcissist's words, every sudden change in story, every emotional tactic used repeatedly is stored and processed. This is not done consciously in a dramatic way, but through constant mental awareness. While the narcissist believes they are successfully rewriting reality, the empath is silently tracking the structure of that manipulation. Over time, this creates a deep internal map of behavior patterns. Nothing is forgotten, even when it appears to be forgiven on the surface. The empath is not naive. They are gathering information while appearing emotionally engaged, which makes their awareness even more underestimated by the narcissist. At a certain point, something shifts internally. Psychologists sometimes describe this as an acute disillusionment response. It is similar to how the immune system reacts when it finally identifies a long-term infection within the body. For a long time, the system tolerates the threat, adapts to it, and tries to function alongside it. But once recognition fully occurs, the response becomes immediate and decisive. For the empath, this moment feels like waking up suddenly after years of mental fog. There is no slow realization, it is instant clarity. It feels as if a hidden light has been switched on in a room they thought they understood, and suddenly everything is visible in its true form without distortion or emotional filtering. In that moment, past experiences are reinterpreted with sharp clarity. What once looked like love begins to appear as structured manipulation. The intense affection at the beginning is no longer seen as romance, but as calculated emotional conditioning designed to create attachment. The unpredictable hot and cold behavior is no longer confusing. It is recognized as a pattern of reinforcement meant to control emotional dependency. Even apologies are no longer interpreted as genuine remorse, but as tactical resets used to regain control after disruption. Once the empath sees these patterns clearly, there is no return to the previous perception. Awareness becomes permanent, and illusion loses its power completely. This marks the beginning of a major internal shift. The empath no longer reacts in the way the narcissist expects. Emotional outbursts, desperate explanations, or attempts to seek validation begin to disappear. Instead, there is a noticeable emotional distance. This change is deeply confusing to the narcissist because their entire system depends on emotional reactions. They rely on visible distress, arguments, and emotional engagement as proof that their control is still active. When those reactions stop, their influence weakens immediately. The empath begins responding in minimal ways, often with short, neutral replies. They stop over-explaining because they realize that their vulnerability has repeatedly been used against them. From a neurological perspective, this shift is significant. Studies such as those associated with the Max Planck Institute suggest that empathic individuals show increased activity in brain regions linked to emotional awareness and social understanding. Under normal conditions, this makes them highly sensitive to others' emotional states, sometimes to their own disadvantage. However, when disillusionment occurs, the brain begins to reorganize its response patterns. Executive control systems become more dominant, allowing the person to analyze situations more strategically rather than emotionally absorbing them. Emotional information is still processed, but it is no longer treated as a personal burden. At this stage, the narcissist's usual strategies begin to fail. They expect predictability because that is what they have relied on. They assume the empath will continue to seek resolution, understanding, or emotional closure. But the empath is no longer operating from that mindset. Their focus shifts from fixing the relationship to understanding the structure of the manipulation itself. They stop trying to repair emotional damage and instead prioritize clarity and distance.
This creates a psychological gap that the narcissist cannot easily bridge because their methods depend entirely on emotional engagement. Eventually, the empath reaches a state that can only be described as complete detachment. There is no dramatic confrontation, no emotional collapse, and no need for final explanations. There is simply a quiet, internal decision that the dynamic no longer has value. This is what makes the situation so destabilizing for the narcissist. They lose access not just to emotional reactions, but to the entire psychological system they were relying on. In many cases, the empath had been unconsciously supporting the narcissist's emotional stability, absorbing frustration, managing conflict, and regulating emotional chaos. Once that support is removed, the structure collapses quickly because it was never self-sustaining. In response, the narcissist often escalates their behavior. They may attempt apologies, emotional manipulation, guilt tactics, or attempts to re-enter the empath's life through indirect channels. However, by this stage, the empath has already studied these patterns in detail. Nothing feels new or surprising anymore. Every tactic is recognizable, almost predictable, because it has already been observed and mentally cataloged. This is why the empath is no longer emotionally accessible in the same way. They are not reacting in real time anymore. They are responding from a position of full awareness. One of the most destabilizing aspects for the narcissist is that empaths often protected their reputation even while being mistreated. They minimized conflict, avoided public exposure, and tried to preserve dignity for both sides. But once detachment is complete, even that protective instinct begins to fade, not out of revenge, but out of clarity. The empath no longer feels responsible for managing the emotional consequences of someone else's behavior. The silence becomes final, and in that silence, the narcissist loses the emotional structure they depended on far more than they realized. They make excuses, smooth over inconsistencies, and even take public blame just to protect the narcissist's image. Over time, this becomes a pattern where the empath is silently holding together a narrative that was never honest to begin with. But the moment the empath stops doing this, something important changes. The carefully built image of the narcissist starts to weaken, not because the empath attacks them, but because they simply stop covering for them. They stop justifying the behavior, stop rewriting events to make things look better, and stop protecting someone else's reputation at the cost of their own truth. The fed-up empath usually does not engage in revenge or public exposure. That is not their natural response. Instead, they do something far more subtle and in many cases more powerful. They stop interfering with reality. They stop filtering what actually happened. They stop softening the truth to make it more acceptable. And when that happens, the narcissist is left exposed to their own actions without any emotional buffer around them. There is no dramatic confrontation required. The truth itself becomes enough. In many cases, this quiet withdrawal of protection does more damage than any planned retaliation could ever do. Within psychological and trauma recovery discussions, this shift is often observed but not widely talked about in everyday conversations. Therapists who work closely with survivors of emotional and psychological abuse often describe a transition phase where individuals move from confusion and self-blame into a state of clarity. It is a point where the internal narrative changes completely. Instead of asking what they did wrong, they begin to clearly see what was done to them. Some clinicians describe this as the moment a victim stops internalizing the dysfunction and starts recognizing the pattern for what it actually is. It is not about sudden forgiveness or emotional reconciliation. It is about understanding incompatibility in a very deep and irreversible way. At this stage, the empath does not necessarily feel hatred toward the narcissist. There is often very little emotional charge left. Instead, there is recognition. The relationship is no longer viewed through emotional attachment, but through clarity. The narcissist is no longer seen as someone to fix, understand, or rescue. They are simply understood as someone who cannot exist in the same emotional space without causing harm. It becomes less about moral judgment and more about internal safety. The connection is not processed as good or bad anymore, but as something that simply cannot continue without damage. Like recognizing something harmful in the environment, the response becomes removal rather than reaction. What makes this dynamic even more interesting is how the narcissist unknowingly contributes to their own undoing. Every boundary they cross teaches the empath where limits need to be established. Every manipulation attempt teaches the empath how the tactic works. Every emotional inconsistency becomes data that strengthens the empath's understanding of the pattern. Without realizing it, the narcissist is continuously educating the empath about their behavior. What begins as confusion for the empath slowly turns into familiarity, and familiarity eventually turns into full recognition. By the time the empath reaches their breaking point, they are no longer emotionally overwhelmed. They are informed, aware, and internally prepared. This is why the transformation feels so decisive. The empath does not leave in chaos, they leave with structure. There is often no dramatic final argument or emotional breakdown. Instead, there is a quiet withdrawal from the entire system. Practical changes follow this decision. Communication stops, access is removed, and life begins to reorganize without the narcissist in it. The efficiency of this process often surprises the narcissist because they expected emotional turbulence, not calm detachment. But that calmness is precisely what makes the shift irreversible. It is not driven by anger anymore, it is driven by clarity. From the narcissist's perspective, this creates a very different kind of loss. They are not dealing with conflict or resistance, which they are familiar with. They are dealing with absence. The empath no longer participates in emotional exchanges, arguments, or attempts to repair anything. There is no attention to feed off, no reaction to provoke, and no emotional engagement to manipulate. For someone who relies heavily on external emotional responses, this creates a deep sense of disorientation. The absence of reaction feels more impactful than any confrontation could. What makes this even more psychologically significant is that empaths often served as emotional stabilizers in these relationships. They absorbed emotional instability, reduced conflict, and maintained a sense of balance even in unhealthy dynamics. When that stabilizing presence is removed, the imbalance becomes visible very quickly. The system that depended on their emotional regulation begins to fall apart. It is not a dramatic collapse in every case, but it is a noticeable loss of structure that cannot be easily replaced. Eventually, what remains is distance, not emotional warfare, not revenge, but separation. And within that separation, the narcissist faces something they are not used to: being irrelevant. For someone who relies on impact, attention, and emotional significance, irrelevance feels more threatening than hostility. Hate still acknowledges their presence. Indifference removes it entirely. That is why the final stage of this dynamic is often silence, not conflict. The empath, on the other hand, moves forward without needing closure in the traditional sense. There is no need to revisit every detail or win emotional validation from the past. The understanding is already complete. What once required emotional energy now requires none. And in that state, there is nothing left to negotiate, explain, or revisit. Only distance remains, and with it, stability. What you're describing sits in the overlap between trauma bonding, emotional conditioning, and what psychologists often call post-realization detachment. It's not a mystical transformation, and it's not about someone suddenly becoming powerful in a dramatic sense. It's more about what happens when a person's nervous system stops interpreting a relationship as something they can repair or stabilize. In long-term emotionally abusive dynamics, especially where manipulation is subtle and repetitive, the mind adapts instead of immediately rejecting the situation. That adaptation is what keeps the connection going. The person begins to normalize inconsistencies, explain away hurtful behavior, and delay their own emotional responses in order to maintain stability. This is not weakness. It is the brain prioritizing attachment and predictability over discomfort. Human beings are wired to preserve connection. even when that connection is damaging. Over time, something important happens in the background. The emotional system starts storing evidence even when the conscious mind is still trying to maintain hope. So while a person may still be emotionally invested on the surface, another part of them is quietly recognizing patterns, repeated cycles, identical apologies, predictable shifts in behavior, and moments where reality doesn't match the narrative being presented. This creates internal tension, often experienced as confusion, fatigue, or emotional numbness. What you're calling the snap or shift is usually not a single moment of awakening, but the point where accumulated internal data crosses a threshold. The brain stops trying to reconcile contradictions. Instead of continuing to interpret new behavior as isolated events, it begins to categorize the entire pattern as one coherent structure. That's when emotional engagement starts to drop, not because feelings disappear instantly, but because the mind stops seeing the situation as solvable. From a neuroscience perspective, this is linked to how the brain balances emotional processing and executive reasoning. Under stress, emotional circuits tend to dominate because they are designed for social survival. But when repeated exposure leads to predictability and harmful behavior, the prefrontal cortex starts to take a more active role. This is where evaluation, pattern recognition, and long-term consequence thinking become stronger than emotional reactivity. The result is not sudden aggression or revenge in most cases, but reduced emotional investment and increased psychological distance. A key misunderstanding is assuming that this shift creates hostility. In reality, it often creates silence. Silence is not passive here. It is a form of cognitive efficiency. Once the brain categorizes a person or situation as consistently unsafe or unproductive to engage with emotionally, it reduces output. Less explanation, less arguing, less emotional justification. This is why the other person may feel like the response has become cold, when in reality it has become filtered through a different internal system. Another layer involves identity reconstruction. In emotionally manipulative relationships, people often build a version of themselves around the idea of understanding, fixing, or enduring. When that framework collapses, there is a temporary phase of disorientation. It can feel like emptiness or detachment, but it is actually a restructuring process. The person is no longer organizing their behavior around managing someone else's emotional state. That shift can feel unnatural at first because it removes a long-standing internal reference point. The idea that empaths become dangerous is more metaphorical than literal. What actually changes is access. When emotional access is removed, so is influence. Manipulative dynamics rely heavily on emotional engagement, whether positive or negative. Attention, reaction, explanation, defense, all of these are forms of engagement that sustain the cycle. When those inputs stop, the system loses fuel. The perceived danger is really just the loss of available control points. There is also something important about memory in these situations. People often think detachment means forgetting or suppressing. In reality, memory remains intact, but its emotional weight changes. Events are no longer re-experienced with the same intensity. They become informational rather than emotional. That's why someone can remember everything clearly but still feel no urge to re-enter the dynamic. The data remains, but the emotional reward system is no longer activated. Another misunderstood aspect is the idea of immunity. It's not that someone becomes immune to manipulation forever. It's that they develop recognition patterns that trigger earlier detection. Once someone understands how a pattern works, they don't need to experience the full cycle again to identify it. That reduces vulnerability significantly, but it also creates faster boundary formation in future interactions. Ultimately, what changes is not personality, but interpretation. The same person who once tried to understand everything begins to prioritize clarity over confusion. The same patience that once enabled tolerance gets redirected into distance. And the same emotional depth that made them stay becomes the reason they leave without prolonged conflict. If you look at it without dramatic framing, it's less about psychological warfare and more about the brain learning through repetition that certain environments do not produce safety or mutual stability. Once that conclusion is reached at a deep level, behavior naturally reorganizes itself around self preservation rather than emotional repair. In the end, what this really comes down to is not revenge, not anger, and not some dramatic turning point. It is awareness. It is the moment a person clearly sees what is happening, understands the pattern behind it, and quietly chooses not to stay in it anymore. There is no need for conflict when clarity is strong enough to guide decisions. The so-called fed-up empath is not becoming dangerous or emotional in response. They are simply becoming honest with themselves about what is healthy and what is not. Once that understanding is complete, their focus naturally shifts toward peace, stability, and self-respect. They stop trying to fix situations that repeatedly cause harm and instead step away from what no longer aligns with their well-being. What remains is distance, calm, and a return to balance, not because someone won a psychological battle, but because they finally chose themselves.